Okay, so now you should be able to see the revision questions that I put on ECI based on study unit 3. If you would like to ask any questions during the session, you are more than welcome to do that. And you can do it in one of two ways. So you can use the chat feature, which is actually on the drop-down menu under More. And the other option that you have under that drop-down feature is after chat, you should see meeting setting, and then on your side, you should see the feature raise hand. I do not see it on my screen as I am the host for the meeting, but if you would like to raise your hand, it should show up on my screen, and then I will know that you would like to ask a question. But what I would like to do is firstly just run through all the questions that were part of the revision worksheet. And once we have done that, I'm just going to give you a few tips with regards to the online test that's coming up on Monday and give you a little bit of clarity about that. I think it is the first online test that you are writing on ECI. So like it is different for me to have to set an online test on ECI, I do understand that it is different for you to write an online test on ECI. So I will try and talk through that a little bit as well. Okay, so for now, I'm going to stop my video so that you can focus just on the questions that are in front of us. And I will go through the questions one at a time. Okay, so question 1 started off by talking about the fact that a variable is any factor or condition that can exist in differing amounts or type. And it goes on to say that an experiment usually has 3 types of variables. So for those of you that actually attended this lecture, I think it was the last theory lecture that we did just before campus closed for the lockdown, I would have said to you that in any scientific investigation or in an experiment, the scientist is trying to look at how only one factor changes or affects another factor. But in order for us to correctly assess how that one factor is causing a change in another factor, the scientist must keep all other factors that may cause a change the same. Okay, so the one factor is the independent variable. And as we change the independent variable, the second factor, namely the dependent variable, changes. And any other factor known as control variables that may affect the experiment, we need to keep absolutely the same. So to answer this question, and for your test on Monday, your online test on Monday, you must know that in an investigation or an experiment, there are 3 variables, namely independent, dependent, and controlled. And you also must know that the independent variable is generally the one that the scientist is changing, and as he or she changes the independent variable, the dependent variable may change as a result of that. So any other factor that may affect the change in the dependent variable must be kept the same, and we call those controlled variables. So that definition on the screen for control variables, you can see that I'm actually holding my cursor over this definition is absolutely important. So it's all other variables that must be kept constant in order to ensure that the results that we get are reliable and valid. Going on to question 2 or 1.2, sorry, you were now given an example and you were told if you want to investigate the effect that changing the angle of the torch has on the length of the shadow, you're now required to identify each of these variables with reasons. So if you look at the example, what I've actually done is to highlight the 2 variables or factors. And if you're given something like this in your online test on Monday, so you may be given an example, it may necessarily not be the example that we are looking at currently, it may be a different example, but the tip that I can give you is from the example, clearly identify the variables as a starting point. So don't worry about whether it's independent or dependent first. just identify the two variables. So if you read this sentence, it says you want to investigate the effect that changing the angle of the torch. Now clearly, angle of the torch is one variable, has on the length of the shadow. And to me, it's very clear that length of the shadow is your second variable. And in this sentence is actually a tip in itself, because it talks about changing the angle of the torch. If angle of the torch is one variable and the investigator or scientist is changing that, straight away you should identify angle of the torch as your independent variable, because the definition of independent variable is always that variable which the investigator is able to and therefore can change. Okay, the other way of then looking at how do we identify independent and dependent variables. In the lecture, I suggested to you, once you've identified the two variables, try and create a statement that shows the relationship between the two. So in this case, the only statement that will make sense is if you had something to the effect of the length of the shadow depends on the angle of the torch. So because your statement is the length of the shadow depends on, length of the shadow is the dependent variable, angle of the torch is my independent variable. If I had to change the sentence and phrase it like, or the other way, the angle of the torch depends on the length of the shadow, that becomes illogical. It does not make sense, and therefore the variables will be identified incorrectly. Okay, so the question asked you to identify the variables. Your independent variable is angle of the torch. So once again, that's the one the investigator is changing. And based on how the investigator changes the independent variable, the dependent variable will change accordingly. So length of the shadow changes because the investigator changes angle of the torch. We can only, at the end of this investigation, say that the length of the shadow is changing as a result of the angle of the torch if we keep all other factors that may affect the length of the shadow the same. So in this case, you've got to ask yourself, what else may affect the length of the shadow? And anything that may affect the length of the shadow, when you are carrying out this investigation, the scientist has to keep those variables the same or keep them constant, and we call those controlled variables. So if you are using a wooden block of a certain size as your object, every time you change the angle of the torch, you have to use the same wooden block in the same position. If you are starting by holding the torch a certain distance away from the object, every time you change the angle of the torch, you have to hold the torch the same distance away from the object. If you do not keep these variables the same or constant, they could affect the length of the shadow. And at the end of the investigation, you are not going to know, is it the angle of the torch that caused the change in the length of the shadow, or is it some other variable that you did not keep constant? So unless there are controlled variables in your experiment, you can't say that your results are accurate at the end. So controlled variables, once again, are all other factors that may affect the investigation that need to be kept constant, and we do that to ensure that our results are reliable and valid. We talk about having a fair test if we are keeping the controlled variables the same. Okay, now going on to question 2, and here this question talks about investigating the diameter. So for those of you that don't know, obviously the diameter is, when you look at a circle, the width across, and half a diameter, for example, is the radius. The circumference is all around the circle. Okay, so here you are talking about the diameter of a crater, and you want to know how the diameter of a crater is affected when you drop an object from different heights. And in this case, you are using a bowl of flour. So I also asked you, if you could, to try this simple investigation at home. And here you could actually have collected data as well and drawn a graph or a table of your data. But if you didn't manage to do that, let us just look at the questions. Okay, so the starting point is to identify the two variables from the statement that you were given. So once again here, if you read, it says you want to investigate the diameter of a crater. So that is our one variable that is formed when you drop a tennis ball from different heights. So the height from which the ball is dropped, that becomes our second variable. Okay, if you were to ask yourself, which of these two variables or factors will the investigator be able to control? You should come to the answer that the investigator can only control the height from which the tennis ball is dropped. If you carried out this investigation at home, you may wish to drop the ball first at a height of 1 meter, then drop the ball from a height of 60 centimeters, and then drop the ball from a height of 30 centimeters. If somebody else is carrying out the investigation, they may choose to start and drop the ball from a height of 2 meters and then bring it down to 1 meter, for example. So because the height from which the ball is dropped is the one that the investigator can change, this is obviously our independent variable. So if you look at the answer for 2.1, the independent variable, height from which the ball is dropped. And based on this independent variable, you're going to get a change to the dependent variable, namely a change in the diameter of the crater. So once again, to make a statement from these two variables, the only statement that would be logical is to say that the diameter of the crater depends, hence it is the dependent variable. The diameter of the crater depends on the height from which the ball is dropped. Okay, so going on to 2.3, you are now asked to list the control variables. Another way you could be asked this in your online test on Monday is, how can we make this test fair? So the only way we can have an investigation or a test that is fair is if we have the control variables all being kept the same. Okay, so here a hint that I gave you, if you did manage to do these questions, was think about what other variables or factors may affect the size of this crater that is formed. So if I chose to start by dropping a tennis ball, specifically a tennis ball from different heights, I need to use that same tennis ball at different heights. I can't start with a tennis ball at 1 meter, decide to go to a marble at 60 centimeters, and then go on to use a rock at 30 centimeters. In that case, the investigation would not be fair. The test would not be fair, the investigation would not be reliable. So one of the control variables here has to be that whatever object you start to use at a particular height, that you continue to use that same object throughout the investigation. So the size of the ball, the mass of the ball, the type of the ball or the object being dropped. Also, if children in a class are doing this, you should assign one child to do a specific task. So if one child is dropping the object, the same child needs to drop the object at different heights. If one child is measuring the diameter of the crater, the same child must measure the diameter of the crater that is created when the ball is dropped from different heights. 2.4 asks you to give a short logical method. Logical means in the correct order and in the correct steps on how to perform the investigation. So I gave you a blurb above in case you wanted to carry it out and you could have used that. So you'll start by filling a deep plastic or cardboard box with flour. You would then choose an object that you wish to drop. In this case, if you choose a tennis ball, and like I said, you could start from a 1 meter height. Once the crater is formed, you'd now need to use a ruler. So you can see here, I'm also talking about the apparatus or the equipment that I'll be using to carry out this investigation. So whenever you're asked about a method for an investigation, please remember it's got to be in the correct order and the correct steps, and you must include whatever equipment or apparatus you will be using to carry out the investigation. So instead of just saying, I will now measure the diameter of the crater, ask yourself, what are you going to use to measure the diameter, and include that as part of your method. Your next step would be that you have to make a record of the diameter of the crater. So generally, you would have a table where you'll say or start off with, from a 1 meter drop, the crater is 5 millimeters. Okay, you'd make a record of it and then repeat the above steps by dropping the tennis ball from a height of 60 centimeters and then finally a 30 centimeter height. 2.5 went on to ask you to draw and label the axes of a graph for this investigation to show learners which variable goes where. Okay, so for your online test on Monday as well, it is important that you know that if you were to take the data from an investigation and plot it as a graph or place it in a table, you have to know which variable is plotted where in terms of a graph or a table. So with regards to a graph, you have to know that the independent variable is always on the x-axis, whereas the dependent variable is always on the y-axis. I would suggest you come up with some sort of way in which to remember this for future purposes. You can think of nx, that is what I use, but if you want to come up with another way to remember it, you have to know independent variable is always plotted on the x-axis, the dependent variable always on the y-axis, and you cannot change that rule. So in this investigation, we established that the diameter of the crater depends on the height of the drop. Diameter of the crater is dependent, hence it is plotted on the vertical y-axis. Height of drop independent, hence it is plotted on the horizontal x-axis. I think this is the last question, question 3 that you were given. In this case, you were given a graph to show the average height of bean plants in different types of soils. So my suggestion would be, if you are given a graph, from the heading of the graph itself, identify the 2 variables. So the heading here clearly states, graph showing the average height of the bean plant. Straight away, that's 1 variable in different types of soil. Here's your second variable. Now, if you want to consider, you can look at this in 2 ways. Which of these 2 variables will the investigator be able to control and change? And if you think about it, we can only choose to plant plants, in this case a bean plant, in the different type of soil. So different type of soil becomes our independent variable. The other way, if we were to generate a statement, the only logical statement will be the average height of the bean plant depends on. So the average height of the bean plant is my dependent variable, making different types of soils my independent variable. So Different types of soils is my independent variable, always plotted on the x-axis. And you can see the heading for the x-axis here, type of soils, height of bean plant, my dependent variable, always plotted on the vertical y-axis. And you can see average height of bean plant as my heading for the independent variable on the y-axis. Okay, so 3.1, name the independent variable. If you were given a graph and you know the independent variable is on the horizontal x-axis, you go to the name on that axis and you straight away have your independent variable. So type of soil. In the same way, if you were given a graph and you're asked to name the dependent variable, all you need to do is go to the heading on the y-axis and you have your dependent variable. In this case, height or average height of bean plant. 3.3 is asking you about the objective of this experiment. In other words, why do we want to carry out this experiment? What do we want to find out by carrying out this experiment? What do we want to investigate by carrying out this experiment? So we want to see how one factor, namely type of soil, is affecting another factor, in this case, the growth of the plant that we are measuring by means of looking at the height of the plant. So this is one way in which you could phrase the objective or the aim of the experiment: to investigate, to determine, to find out if the type of soil affects the height of a plant. You could also state your objective as to determine which type of soil is best for growing bean plants. That is also a perfectly acceptable objective for this experiment. 3.4, what can you conclude from the information recorded on the graph? So this question now requires you to analyze the data given on the graph. And if you look at it carefully, you could see that the plant that is grown in sand only reached an average height of 3.5 centimeters, whereas plants grown in clay did slightly better and managed to reach an average height of about 4.1 centimeters, whereas plants grown in loam obviously grew the best because their average height is around 7.2 centimeters. So based on the data given on the graph, your conclusion can be loam is the best type of soil for growing plants, or in this case, we grew bean plants. The last question, it says, explain how you would encourage learners to conduct a fair test for this experiment. Give examples on how we could ensure our results are reliable. So once again, with this question, you need to be asking yourself, what are the control variables for this investigation? So what else, what other factors over and above the type of soil are going to affect the growth and the average height of the bean plant? So all of you should know it is in the life skills foundation phase CAPS document what plants need to grow. So as foundation phase teachers, you all should have a clear understanding that plants over and above soil, they need sunlight in order to grow, they need water in order to grow, they should have the right or correct temperature in order to grow properly. They also need air, specifically carbon dioxide. So the only way we can conclude that the type of soil is affecting the height of the bean plant is if the conditions that we subject each of these different plants to are kept exactly the same. So if we give the plants grown in sand 10 milliliters of water per day, we need to give the plants grown in clay and loam exactly the same amount of water, 10 milliliters. If we are placing the plants grown in sand in a particular place where they receive a certain amount of sunlight, where the temperature is a certain amount, we must ensure that the plants grown in clay receive the same amount of sunlight and the same temperature, and the plants grown in loam receive the same amount of sunlight with the same temperatures. So whatever environmental factors we expose one set of plants to, we must expose the other set of plants to it. So at the end of this investigation, if there's a difference in the growth and the height of the plants, we now know, because we kept all other factors the same, we now can conclude that the type of soil is definitely the factor that is causing a difference in the height of the plant. So that is the answer for this experiment. It's talking about what variables must be kept constant or must be kept the same. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to start my video. And I would like to please ask for questions with regards to what we've done. You're welcome to turn on your mic and speak if you have any specific questions. Otherwise, I'll go on to what is required for the online test on Monday. Okay, I don't see any questions coming through. So if you would like to ask questions, like I said, please use the chat feature and I will check again in the chat room if there are any questions at the end. So I will carry on sharing my screen and talking about the online test that is going to be on Monday. Okay, so now you should be able to see on the Word document a few pointers that I've put up with regards to the online test on Monday. I've just got a reminder that this meeting ends in 10 minutes. So I'm just going to carry on going through these points. So for your online test, you will obviously be doing the test on ECI and you will see the link will open up at the correct time. So all you have to do is click on the online test and you into the portal. So there's absolutely no downloading and uploading of files. Okay, there is a series of shorter multiple choice questions like with your quiz. So where you're required to choose an answer. With your quiz, you're choosing options, either A, B, C, or D. With something like true and false, you're choosing either true and false. So for your test, there is going to be a certain number of shorter questions. But because it's now a test that is weighted 15% over and above a class task like your quiz, which is weighted less, there has to be longer questions as well. For the longer questions, you will be required to type an answer. Okay, so please know that there's going to be a series of short questions as well as longer questions, but everything is online. You can't upload a Word document, for example. That is not allowed. The time limit is 1 hour. So if you're going to think that it is an open book test and you're going to have time to go through the PowerPoint, start looking for answers in your textbook, you're going to find that you will not finish the test. So please, I urge you to make sure that you finish your revision before you start to attempt the test. Because what happens is it's going to start timing you down. And there's going to be a clock to the right on your screen. It's going to go by minute and I think even seconds. It can be distracting if you want to put a sticky note over it to cover it and just keep your phone next to you to sort of time yourself. by all means do that. But from the time you start, you've got 1 hour. If you don't finish the test at that 1 hour, it will submit automatically. So whatever you have answered will be marked, okay? Like with your quiz, you've only got 1 attempt. Once done, you can't re-enter the portal and attempt the test of the again. I think I've told you over and over again that the units to be covered are 1, 2, and 3. The reading from your textbook, chapter 1, and there's the page numbers. I got a question about which specific page numbers from your textbook need to be covered. So I've put this up as well. It's page 1 to 41. I will be putting all of this information that you see on the screen on ECI. So please don't stress if you're not able to now take it down. There's no need for that. Please make adequate arrangements for the session. So ensure that there's not going to be any disturbances in your life in that 1 hour session. Switch your phone off, tell your parents or whoever is in the house that you need this 1 hour undisturbed in order to finish the test. And the total marks for the test are 40. I think that is more than adequate to be completed in an hour because there are short questions as well as a few longer questions that are going to require you to think about the answer a little bit before answering the questions. But there always has to be a certain number of higher order questions in any assessment. Okay, I'm going to stop the share. And I've got 2 questions in the chat. One of the questions is, hi ma'am, is it possible to put up more examples of similar problems just for practice purposes? I can try. I must admit I'm swamped at the moment trying to do new assessments, but I will definitely try. And if I am able to do that, I will put a notice up on ECI. Noel, I take it that is with regards to identifying variables. Okay, so please just correct me if I'm wrong. Another question, some of us haven't been able to purchase our textbook due to finances. Do we need the notes inside them to prepare, or can we rely on the notes on ECI as well as what was said in lectures? Okay, what was said in lectures and the PowerPoints are adequate, but there were certain questions on the PowerPoint where you are required to refer to your textbook to answer those questions. My suggestion here would be, please ask your friends to take screenshots of those pages and send them to you. Unfortunately, the textbook is an important resource. Okay, a question from Jordan Jade. Good question. The time for the test I have not finalized as yet. It is definitely on Monday, but what time I'm going to open the portal, I have not finalized as yet. I will definitely finalize that by tomorrow, and you will receive that notification on ECI. Thank you for that question. Another question, if possible, can you put up the prescribed reading on ECI? Some of us don't have textbooks. I worry about copyright with regards to that. I will have to check with my HOD before being able to do that. Okay, another question. We have gone over Unit 1 and 3. Can we have more information on what to cover for Unit 2 to prepare for the test? I would say for Unit 2, look at the information that is given to you in the PowerPoint and in your textbook. Sorry, I'm just scrambling and looking through the textbook at the moment while answering this question. The information for Unit 2 in your textbook is on page 36 to page 41. That's the information from your textbook relevant to Unit 2 that you need to look at over and above the information in the PowerPoint.